Well, it's 4:15, so let's go ahead and get started. This is, I think many of you guys probably know my voice. This is Bob Beal, the Executive Director of ASMFC. And I just want to kick off the last session of today. With us, we have Marissa Trego. She's a Take Reduction Team Coordinator from GARFO. And she's going to provide essentially a two-part presentation this afternoon. The first part will be on the Atlantic large whale take reduction efforts in the final rule. That are focused on Jonah crab and lobster fish, pot fishery, trap and pot fisheries in the Northeast, and some recent decisions this weekend that Chip mentioned a moment ago by Judge Walker in the Maine Federal District Court may raise some questions and make that a little bit more interesting than they would have been or could have been. And the second piece of Marissa's presentation is going to be on the scoping portion of federal rulemaking that's focused on gill nets along the Atlantic coast, as well as mixed species, trap and pot fisheries in the mid-Atlantic region. So with that, I think we'll go ahead and kick it off to Marissa. One comment, though, is that ASMFC has not developed a comment letter on scoping efforts for the second round of the presentation that Marissa will talk about. Those comments are due on Friday, so it'd be really tricky for ASMFC to pull together a lengthy letter by Friday and get it over to NOAA Fisheries. However, if there are a couple small points that the states would want to make, keep that in mind as we go through this presentation, and we can talk about that on Thursday at the policy board. And again, it'll have to be a very short letter with only a couple points that the states feel are really important to make from the commission perspective. So we can do that, but it's going to have to be really focused. So with that, Marissa, if you are ready to go, I think we are all set, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. I think you guys have my slides. Oh, perfect. And I apologize. That should have been updated to October, not September. I will open it up to Chip if you wanted to start with a brief statement he mentioned, and then I'll get going.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me?
We can, Chip.
Okay, thanks, Tony. This is Chip Lynch with NOAA General Counsel. Just want to say preliminarily, great to hear you all this morning and today. I'm really looking forward to getting back to normal and seeing you all in person. I wasn't expecting to have to present today, but we had a decision made by a judge this Saturday that's sort of causing me to be here. As background, a couple of weeks ago, a Maine industry group, I'm going to refer to them as a lobster union, that's one of sort of their title, challenged a portion of NOAA's new whale rule that was designed to protect right whales through numerous measures, but most important for this case is a proposed closure of a 967 square mile section of Area 1, right on that 1-3, just inside the 1-3 line, and it was going to close it to fishing with end lines. And the rule was intended to go into effect today, the 18th. So this Saturday, the 16th, the court reached a decision and agreed with the lobster union and granted them a temporary restraining order and preliminary injunction, ruling that NOAA could not enforce the Area 1 closure to vertical lobster buoy lines during the pendency of this litigation. So the order is an interim order that's effective while the larger case is being litigated. And what that essentially means is these lawsuits can sometimes take a long time to proceed through the court system. It can take a couple of years, sometimes more, but around a couple of years. And sometimes during those couple of years while something is litigated, impacts can be had where people just can't wait for the final decision to be made. And that's what a temporary restraining order is and a preliminary injunction. Essentially, that is people coming in to the judge and saying, hey, can we just pump the brakes here a little bit before we get to the formal briefing and formal discussion and presenting of evidence? We just do nothing, because if things in the years that we wait for the final court decision, we could be irreparably harmed. So that's sort of the background of temporary restraining orders generally. So the court did rule, and again, it's interim. So after this matter is briefed over the months and all, it's possible that the court can go in whatever direction it wants at the time. It could potentially find for NOAA. It could potentially remain its finding for the plaintiffs. The other thing is that the order is limited to the Area 1 closure. The court rendered no opinion on the remainder of the NOAA rule. The remainder of the rule simply wasn't a part of this case. So at present, NOAA is having internal discussions and discussions with the Justice Department on its options. Yeah, the preliminary matter, of course, NOAA is going to follow the judge's ruling. That is, we're not going to enforce the closure, and the agency is sending out a notice to the industry that gear doesn't need to be removed. In fact, I think I saw a bulletin that has already been posted on the website. So that's happening in real time. The next thing is that NOAA is also trying to assess whether or not to appeal this ruling. I've read the ruling. There's certainly grounds for an appeal, but there's a lot that goes into the appeal decision beyond a simple weighing of the merits. Timing issues, resource issues, there's a lot that goes into it. To the extent the ruling stands, the agency is then going to need to examine the potential ramifications of this decision, including potential far-reaching and unintended consequences to the fishery in order to find a path forward. But again, the decision came out late Saturday afternoon. So we are at the early stages of trying to figure out what exactly is the best response here. And that's the story with the court order that came out over the weekend. And if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Tony, this is Bob. Are there any hands up before Marissa takes off?
I'm just giving a second. I don't see any hands at this time.
All right, great, thanks. And Chip, you'll be around for the entire presentation if there's any questions at the end?
I will.
Good deal. Thank you, Chip. And Marissa, it's all yours. Thank you.
Thank you. No worries. And thank you so much, Chip. Okay, so thank you all for coming and staying tuned to our presentation. And thanks to all of my colleagues. So Colleen Coogan is also on the phone, as well as Crystal Franco, Chauzo, and Jen Goebel. So this is team effort. And so first I'll go into a bit of a, next slide, please. I'll go into a bit of a background on why we're here. So that includes a broad overview of the Atlantic Large Whale Take Reduction Plan and the status of North Atlantic right whales. And after that, I'll get into that short summary of phase 1 and where we are with phase 2 and those scoping ideas. Next slide, please. So despite a lot of work over the past few decades to recover the North Atlantic right whale, the population began declining again around 2010. So this graph shows the estimated population size over time in green and the estimated annual mortality in orange. And the bars in blue represent the new mom-calf pairs sighted each year, which is indicative of how well the population is able to replace deaths each year. And as you'll notice, the estimated mortality in recent years has far surpassed the number of mother-calf pairs sighted and indicates that the population is not going to be able to recover until mortality is drastically reduced. The increase in estimated mortality that occurred over the last decade also occurred on top of mortality levels that were already above what was considered sustainable for this population. This change is partly due to the change in right whale distribution that moved whales into areas where they had not commonly been sighted during the previous decade. So there were few protections in place ready when they showed up in these areas more frequently. So there's a need to take additional broad proactive measures to further reduce right whale mortality and serious injury in U.S. waters where right whales are found year-round. Next slide, please. So in 2017, an unusual mortality event was declared when 17 right whales died, several as a result of fishing entanglement or vessel strikes. Currently, the population is estimated to have less than 370 animals, fewer than 100 of which are potential mothers. And during the UME, mortalities and serious injuries that likely lead to death have outnumbered new moms with calves spotted in the southeast every year during calving season. And there were also an additional 5 serious entanglements that would have resulted in death if they were not successfully disentangled. Next slide, please. And of these mortalities, the vast majority are a result of entanglement in fixed fishing gear or impact by a vessel. So since 2017, there were 34 mortalities and 18 serious injuries. There are also a few incidents where cause of death was not determined, but evidence doesn't rule out human causes of death in these cases. So this year, there was also 1 perinatal mortality discovered, which is an additional indicator of concern regarding reproductive failure and the low population growth that I discussed in the previous slide. And in parentheses, we have included the country where the incident was first cited or where it originated. So while we cannot confirm the location of most entanglements, there's plenty of evidence that mortality and serious injury due to entanglement or vessel strike are occurring in both countries at unsustainable levels. Next slide, please. In the US, we are mandated to reduce mortality and serious injury to levels below the potential biological removal level, or PBR. Here we have the observed number of mortalities and serious injuries in each year, with those that were first seen in the US in gray and those confirmed in the US waters in black. Those in blue represent individuals that avoided mortality or serious injury due to disentanglement. And those were either first sighted or confirmed to have occurred in the US waters as well. And in white, we have included the tentative number of serious injuries that were first seen in the US in 2021. So in each of these years, the observed mortalities and serious injuries were above PBR, with the exception of 2013, when there was a partial serious injury. And PBR has been consistently less than 1 individual per year, and we expect that number to go down next year from 0.8 to 0.7. And this only represents the observed mortality, and new research suggests that observed incidents could represent as low as 40% of the total estimated mortality in each year. Next slide, please. The Marine Mammal Protection Act requires us to create a take reduction plan when mortality and serious injury in U.S. commercial fisheries is above PBR. The Atlantic Large Whale Take Reduction Plan was created at the end of the 90s to develop recommendations to reduce large whale mortality and serious injury in fixed gear fisheries. It is a consensus-based process that includes 60 stakeholders at the table, including state managers, federal managers, academics, NGOs, and about 23 fishermen. The team is tasked with addressing risk to right, humpback, and fin whales, though right whales have largely been the focal species due to its small population size. And it's important to note that though the team is supposed to make recommendations to NIMS, NIMS has the ultimate responsibility to take action to reduce mortalities and serious injuries. Next slide, please. So before we get into some of those scoping ideas for phase 2, I'll just give you a short summary of the rulemaking effort we just finalized a few weeks ago. So as you all know by now, we just completed phase 1 of our current effort to reduce right whale mortality and serious injury, which aimed to reduce the risk of right whale entanglement in northeast lobster and Jonah crab trap-pot fisheries, which is where the vast majority of buoy lines occur along the east coast of the US. Next slide, please. So one way the new measures will reduce the chances of a right whale becoming entangled in fishing gear is by restricting lobster and Jonah crab fishing in 3 new areas where we expect higher right whale densities, shown here in green. So one of these areas is an expansion of the existing Massachusetts restricted area north into Massachusetts state waters from February through April. There will also be, or were also 2 new areas included in the final rule. So there's the South Island restricted area south of Cape Cod that will restrict fishing from February through April, and the one that Chip mentioned in the beginning, so LMA1 restricted area that would have restricted fishing from October through January. And as he mentioned, the implementation of that restricted area has been delayed. And because the buoy lines used in those fisheries currently pose the greatest risk to whales, we will also be allowing fishing with ropeless gear that does not use buoy lines in these new and existing restricted areas. So both of the ones in blue and green in this image with the appropriate permit. So we're not requiring the use of ropeless gear, but we will have this as an option available to those who are still interested in testing it out. Next slide, please. So we will also be reducing the number of buoy lines throughout the region by increasing the number of traps that can be fished on a trap trawl with either 1 or 2 buoy lines. So this map shows the complex landscape of minimum trawl length requirements that will be implemented in federal waters, where the areas in color represent new, longer minimum trawl lengths throughout the region, and the areas in gray represent areas that will not be required to change their trawl length, either because they're in exempted areas or there are regulations that are being implemented that are expected to have a greater impact on entanglement risk, such as restricted areas or maximum line strength. Next slide, please. So in addition to reducing the chances of an entanglement, we are implementing some additional precautionary measures throughout the entire Northeast region. If a whale is still entangled in a buoy line, we want to reduce the chances of death or serious injury. So to address this, we will be requiring the use of weaker buoy lines that break at 1,700 pounds or less. This can be accomplished either through the use of full-length weak lines or inserts within the buoy lines. We're also interested in further improving our knowledge of where entanglements are occurring. We will be requiring additional marks in all buoy lines, including those in exempted waters in the Northeast. Buoy lines will have new state or area-specific colors that represent the principal port of the fishing vessel or fishing area where gear is being set. Gear that is fished in federal waters will also be required to have Northeast-specific federal marks to further distinguish these trawls from those being set in state waters. Next slide, please. And so now we're starting phase 2, which will aim to reduce remaining risk of entanglement from U.S. commercial fixed gear fisheries along the entire East Coast. And we're currently in our scoping period where we're collecting ideas from the public as well as the council and commissions to consider during our next round of rulemaking. Next slide, please. For phase 2, we will need to further reduce entanglement risk throughout the right whale's range in U.S. waters. So the area here in green is the area in U.S. waters that is included in the Atlantic Large Whale Take Reduction Plan. During this phase, we will be moving towards a target that is based on estimated mortality in response to new peer-reviewed publications that came out this year, and to be consistent with other TRTs that typically manage based on estimated mortality rather than observed mortality. We're still working on refining this target as we reevaluate the new population data that will likely be coming out soon, including that lower PBR that I mentioned, but currently it's looking closer to our original upper risk reduction target. And the Atlantic Large Whale Take Reduction team began meeting in the spring of this year to discuss the baseline risk of fixed gear fisheries along the coast, and many individuals on the team generated initial ideas for us to bring to our scoping meetings to get the conversation started. Next slide, please. Just to orient you to where we are in this process, this is still pretty early in our timeline. We have a few things occurring concurrently, which includes that TRT process that we already started, our rulemaking process, and an environmental impact process known as NEPA. And so all of the ideas that are collected throughout all of these processes will contribute to the others so that we're taking as much feedback as possible. And this meeting specifically, or this presentation specifically, is part of our scoping period, where we're asking for people to provide input, but it's not the only opportunity. So after we have a draft environmental impact statement and proposed rule, there will be an additional opportunity to provide input based on the proposed changes, what the TRT recommended, as well as our final analyses. And these discussions will likely continue into next year with the goal of a final rule in 2023. Next slide, please. To aid in this process, we have been working with the Northeast Fisheries Science Center to update their decision support tool in order to guide our decision about where risk is occurring to reduce the chances of entanglement. So the tool was reviewed by the Center for Independent Experts in 2019, and it was used in our most recent final environmental impact statement. Today, I will only be talking about one small aspect of that model, which is the co-occurrence of whales and gear. So we're particularly interested in areas of high co-occurrence, or in other words, a high overlap between predicted whale density and gear density. Though precautionary measures will also be needed in areas of low co-occurrence because, as we know, whales can sometimes shift their distribution. The right whale density is predicted using sightings data and associated environmental variables that predict whale density in areas of based on habitat characteristics. And the gear density includes where the gear is set and includes buoy lines for all gear, as well as the height of the net in the water column for gill nets. And so this is based on all of the fishery data we have available to us through reporting and other means of collecting fishery information. If you go to the Take Reduction Plan website, you can find more information about model documentation, as well as some informational webinars that can give you more details on the tool. Next slide, please. So I'm going to be showing you a few coastwide maps of particular regions of co-occurrence, as well as whale density. And I'll start in the Northeast and kind of move south. So when we look at co-occurrence in the Gulf of Maine and southern New England of gillnet gear, we can identify the level of overlap between predicted right whale density and that gear map. So these monthly maps show you a gradient of co-occurrence on a log scale from dark colors representing lower overlap to yellow areas representing areas of higher co-occurrence. So this can be helpful to see which areas are showing the most risk based on where the gear is currently being fished and where the whales are expected to be. So as you can see, there are several spots around southern New England and in offshore areas that are showing up on this as a little bit higher co-occurrence. Next slide, please. And when we look at mixed species trap bot gear, we're seeing several spots around Massachusetts and southern New England as well that are particularly bright. And this aligns with the increase in whale presence in southern New England waters that we have been seeing. So I will note that the data in May is highlighted here primarily because the fishery data is made up of several years before the Massachusetts restricted area had formally been extended into May. But it isn't likely that we will see risk in that area next year if we update that data because of some recent measures from Massachusetts state waters. And so just wanted to note that isn't quite updated in the model yet. We will be further refining the model to incorporate some of these more recent changes in current management practices before our next decision and support tool update for our team in a few weeks. Next slide, please. And the co-occurrence maps I just showed you also don't really account for that whale density, given it can only show areas of high co-occurrence where there's also high gear densities. So if there isn't gear in some places, it won't show up as having high co-occurrence. So it's also important to consider where gear would be moving in response to any risk reduction measures, and whether that would just create a new spot of high risk if whales are present. So this map can help show you the raw whale habitat density score. And as you can see, there are larger areas that are highlighted showing broader areas of particular importance to right whales according to that habitat model. And given what we know, which is that right whales can also appear in areas that we can't predict, it will also be important to consider some of those broad precautionary measures across the entire region, as I mentioned earlier. Next slide, please. So moving down the coast in the mid-Atlantic, we can see that the overlap between predicted right whale density and trap pot gear is highest along the coast of the mid-Atlantic in winter and spring, particularly in particularly in the mid-Atlantic, mid-South Atlantic gillnet waters regulated by the Atlantic Large Whale Take Reduction Plan. And next slide, please. And co-occurrence between right whales and gillnet gear show a lot of areas of high overlap in winter and spring that are more concentrated in the north end of the mid-Atlantic and southern New England compared to that gillnet map. So the difference in co-occurrence between these gear types is likely driven by where the types of gear are rather than that whale density. So next slide, please. If we are able to look at that raw whale density, it shows us a different pattern that aren't apparent with just those co-occurrence maps. So looking at that broad whale presence along the mid-Atlantic coast that starts in December and increases in about January through April and starts to decline in May. Next slide, please. And in the Southeast, they've taken a lot of proactive measures. So the co-occurrence for trap pot and gillnet in the region is relatively low. However, because the Southeast is particularly important for calves, we are concerned about the reproductive rate of the population. So we are still looking for broad precautionary measures that will reduce the risk and lethality of fixed gear when whales will be in that area as well. So as you can see in the image on the right, in the Southeast, this is highly seasonal. So in October through May are really the primary months of concern when calves start showing up in October, end of November, and start leaving by May and June. Next slide, please. So in order to get the conversation started, I'm going to go over some of the general ideas that team members provided in June and July. These ideas come from a wide range of stakeholders and are a starting point to get additional input during our scoping meetings. So we welcome additional ideas that you have to bring to the table that might help us address entanglement risk from any fixed gear fisheries along the coast. Next slide, please. So these are the current areas managed under the take reduction plan that we are looking for scoping input on. Some of the ideas the team wanted input on included those that might reduce the chances of entanglement by reducing the overlap between right whales and gillnet gear specifically. So these include reducing soaking time and restricting overnight soaks for gillnet gear. Also changing the number of nets on a string to reduce the number of buoy lines or length of the net panels. It was also recommended that we evaluate the use of tie downs to reduce the height of nets in the water column. And one other idea included testing ropeless gear. So for example, requiring a buoy line on one end to use ropeless gear in order to cut buoy lines in half. Next slide, please. And these are the current trap pot areas managed under the take reduction plan that we're looking for some scoping input on. So some of the ideas that the team suggested we look for input on included those that increase the number of minimum traps on a trawl outside of areas in the Southeast. So it was specifically recommended that the Southeast in particular should keep fishing singles because it's a calving area and therefore that weaker gear is preferable for small neonates and calves. Additional ideas included lowering trap caps and implementing trap caps in certain fisheries that may not already have one. And it was also suggested that NIMS consider extending the final rule from phase 1 to other trap pot fisheries in the Northeast so that all trap pot gear in this area have consistent requirements. Next slide, please. So we also received several recommendations to consider for restricted areas. One was to reevaluate existing restricted areas, which would include allowing testing of ropeless gear in these areas and reevaluating the boundaries or timing of the current areas included in the plan. So specific regions that were suggested were the Great South Channel restricted area and the Southeast restricted areas north and south. Two suggestions were also provided specifically for expanding the Cape Cod Bay restricted area, which is the area shown here in orange. So one idea would be to expand that area throughout the bay in both state and federal waters to line up with new state water closures. Those are shown here in yellow. And the other would further expand that closure throughout North Massachusetts state waters to the New Hampshire border, and that's that area in blue, which would be similar to that new Massachusetts restricted area expansion that is written into our plan for trap pots. Next slide, please. We also received additional suggestions for new restricted areas based on hotspots. Specific ideas include rolling restricted areas or delayed fishing seasons that would be implemented up the mid-Atlantic coast in line with anticipated whale density as right whales move north. Another idea was a restricted area in southern New England, according to a preliminary coastwide hotspot analysis that showed high co-occurrence, which is shown here on this map, where areas in color represent aggregated risk within this region. A hotspot analysis is one way that we can look at how spatially aggregated risk is to see how effective spatial management might be. This shows the top 80% of risk along the entire east coast of gear, and it's an area that continues to show up as important on different analyses, since we know it's increasing in importance for right whales. So including that right whale distribution map I showed earlier in southern New England. So we are interested in input on approaches to creating restricted areas based on the final hotspot analyses we provide to the team next year, and in particular, the suggestion for a new restricted area in southern New England. Obviously, we just implemented one, but this was only for lobster and Jonah crab trap pot. It doesn't extend to things like gillnet or necessarily to mixed species trap pots. So we would like input on ideas for dynamic area management as well that would be responsive to whale sightings in real time. We currently do not have the ability to do this well, so we have some procedural limitations that prevent us from implementing successful responsive dynamic management, and our attempts in the past have typically included a lag time of about 2 weeks to prevent real-time response to sightings. However, we are exploring whether dynamic management would be possible and would like input on what to consider for possible implementation. So this includes questions like what the trigger would be and how big of an area it would impact. Next slide, please. So in addition to reducing the chances a whale will become entangled, similar to phase 1, we also want to get ideas on additional precautionary measures that would reduce the severity of an entanglement if it did occur. Ideas that would reduce gear strength include requiring rope to have a maximum breaking strength of 1,700 pounds or regular inserts with a similar maximum breaking strength. An idea was also put forth to consider capping line diameter, which could both reduce current line strengths and help differentiate US gear from Canadian gear, where larger line is often used. And some ideas specific to gillnet gear would include expanding gear modifications to require additional weak inserts year-round in the mid-Atlantic, where they have seasonal requirements, and reducing the strength of some weak inserts in combination with a smaller anchor. Next slide, please. We are also looking for input on gear marking modifications that will further improve our ability to spot marks on whales from different platforms or offer greater resolution as to where entanglements are occurring. So we're still unable to get identifying information from most entanglements, sometimes because the gear is no longer observable and all we see is evidence of rope, but also sometimes because we can't always recover the gear or spot an identifiable mark on the gear that can be seen if recovery isn't possible. So some ideas include marks that are better able to distinguish between different states, between state and federal waters, between countries, as well as between gear types. So obviously this information would allow us to greatly improve the effectiveness of our measures in the future with more information. Next slide, please. And lastly, I do want to mention that several of these recommendations are ideas that we would need to work on in collaboration with fishery managers, particularly those that would change the amount of fishing effort. So for gillnet, that includes evaluating and capping latent effort to make sure our regulations are effectively reducing gear, considering limited entry for fisheries that are still open access fisheries, and any effort reduction that is related to soak time or the number of nets on the string, for example, for gillnet. And the team also noted, just in particular, the challenge with determining effort related to unmanaged fishery, which is particular to gillnet fisheries. And another suggestion that was provided included developing consequences for documented takes, and we're asking for input on what that might look like. So as of now, that would be fairly challenging to implement, particularly without the participation of fishery managers. So if anyone has any ideas on the type or scope of such an action, please provide that in your comments. Next slide, please. So these bullets give you some idea of the specific topics we're looking for input on that would reduce large whale entanglement risk with a particular focus on right whales. We welcome any input on any of the measures that I presented today. We're also open to additional measures that we should consider, such as other ways to reduce gear or effort, new restricted areas to implement, and other ways to reduce strength or lethality of gear. We're also hoping for additional ideas that would improve what we know about where entanglements are occurring through gear marking. And to make sure we can evaluate these measures, we would like any additional information that you have on current fishing practices that we could use to understand our operation of the fishery. Next slide, please. And that is about all I have for you today. I will just mention that our scoping period ends on Thursday, October 21st, and you can provide written comments to the email on the screen or provide comments after this. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, Marissa. Really appreciate the presentation. Very informative and efficient. And question for the group. Are there any questions or comments for Marissa or Chip on Judge Walker's weekend decision or NOAA's reaction to it, phase 1 final rule or phase 2 scoping information? Any hands up, Tony?
Pat Kelleher.
Pat.
Thanks, Bob.
There you go.
Yeah, I just had to remember to hit my mute button here. Thanks, Marissa, for that presentation. I think I have a question for both Marissa and for Chip. For Marissa, you piqued my interest here with asking for input on dynamic management areas. That is something that I thought the agency was leaning away from based on prior conversations that related to the trap pot fishery. Just wondering if there's been a change of thinking there.
There hasn't been a change of thinking, but it's been something that's been coming up a lot, and our people on our team wanted us to scope on it, so we're getting input on it to see if it's possible. It still currently isn't possible with the setup that we have, but we're scoping on getting input on it if anybody has any other ideas.
Okay, thanks for that clarification. It's my understanding that the issue really was around emergency authority to be able to trigger something quick enough. Is that still kind of the overarching problem?
That is still one of the main parts of the problem, as well as things like our NEPA process, which is very slow. So putting out a NEPA analysis every time would be hard to implement fast. So
okay.
Yeah.
All right, thank you. And for Chip, I just wanted to make sure I heard you correctly. If the agency didn't appeal, or maybe if you did, or even if you didn't, you would be considering additional action to make up that loss of risk. Is that what you were hinting at?
Well, yeah, I wouldn't call it a hint. I guess I guess my thinking at this point in time is that all options and responses are on the table. I mean, necessarily, because I mean, at this point in time, we're trying to figure out what exactly is going to be the fallout, and is there going to be a need to do something further, and we just don't know at this point in time. But I can't say that is not something either, if that makes sense.
Okay, yeah, thanks, I appreciate that.
Thanks, Pat. You all set?
Yeah, I'm good.
Okay, great. Any other hands, Tony?
No hands at this time, Bob.
All right, great. Well, not seeing any more hands or hearing from Tony that more hands are popping up. It sounds like, oh, yeah, go ahead, Tony.
We have Erica Burgess.
Erica, please go ahead. Might be on mute, Erica.
Can y'all hear me?
Now we got you. Yep.
All right. Thanks, Bob. And thanks for the presentation. I held off a little bit to raise my hand because my question is not directly related to the presentation today, but it is related to the take reduction plan. I heard that we may also be seeing regulations coming for vessel speed zones in the Southeast and Mid-Atlantic. Can the NOAA staff who's here today speak to that at all?
I'll jump in, Marissa. Thanks, Erica. This is Colleen. We are not the staff working on that. That's being done out of our headquarters office, but they are working on modifications to the vessel speed rule and are hoping to have a proposed rule out early in the new year.
And has that gone through the scoping already, Colleen?
I am not certain what their scoping plans are or whether they can take the comments that they received on their review of the 2008 rule as scoping, particularly if they can do the analysis within an EA.
Thanks for the extra info.
Thanks, Colleen. And Eric, you know, Colleen, I guess if you do learn anything else about scoping process, if you could let us know, we can share it with the with our member states very easily. So appreciate that. Tony, any other comments or hands up?
No additional hands at this time, Bob.
All right. I'll pause for a moment. I'm not hearing anything. So I'd like to thank Marissa and Colleen and Chip and all the other NOAA folks that were here to provide backup and the presentation today. Really appreciate it. Yeah, the same statement out to our member states that I mentioned at the very beginning, which is, you know, if there is something very specific and somewhat brief that we can provide to NOAA Fisheries by this Friday, we can pull together a short letter. But again, it's going to have to be very focused and you know, pretty concise and to the point. So with that, I think we are all done for the day, and we'll start tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Thank you all for your time today, and we'll talk to you soon.